and welcome to Doing Disasters Differently, the podcast with Renae Hanvin, which is all about inspiring you to start thinking and doing disasters a little bit differently too. In this episode, I'm talking with Chris Quin, and he's the Director of Resilient Projects. And we're talking about the new era of infrastructure resilience. So a little bit about Chris. As the Director of Resilient Projects, Chris holds a master's degree in disaster preparedness and reconstruction and is a certified practicing project director. Chris has a keen interest in resilient infrastructure and disaster preparedness and mitigation projects, and has extensive experience in providing successful resilient solutions to state government, local government, large utilities, and emergency services organisations. Chris has worked in the response, recovery, and reconstruction effort to major natural disasters such as Cyclone Debbie, Marsha, and Yasi, and more recently in the Townsville floods, and is an active member of the Queensland State Emergency Service. Hi, Chris. Thanks so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, I always like to start with where we meet because I feel we meet as people before we become stakeholders. So Chris is based in Townsville, which is quite a distance away from me in Melbourne. And we were introduced at the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience and AFAC conference in Melbourne in August 2019. I think it was Amanda Lamont who connected us.
It was.
And I have to say, it's been a blossoming alignment ever since, with some really robust conversations relating to infrastructure, which I'll be honest with you, I didn't really know anything about or even that it existed before I spoke to you and met you. But we also talk about organisational resilience and community resilience. And what I like most is that we get where each other is coming from. So even though we come from really different kind of mindsets, we get where each other's coming from and we respect the value that we each bring into the mix because we're all actually contributing to the same outcome. Is that your take?
Agree. Absolutely agree.
So it's not just me pretending or inventing it.
Not at all.
So I want to start with, and this is a question that I kind of pretended I knew the answer to, which I blatantly didn't when I first got introduced to you at the conference. So what is infrastructure resilience?
It's a great question. It's a complex question, but we'll sort of bring it back to some pretty key elements. Infrastructure itself are the systems that we rely on every day without even knowing it. These are our transport systems, electricity, water, all of those things that we can't do without all of those things that we can't do without, but we really don't appreciate them until we don't have them. And infrastructure resilience is really making sure that our infrastructure, networks and systems and the assets that comprise them are up to the task of providing that infrastructure under a wide range of circumstances. And it becomes really, really important, especially when we're confronted with a crisis or a natural hazard or a technological hazard, that the systems are built really well and that they're very robust and able to continue providing that service. So
can you tell me, who does infrastructure resilience relate to then? And I'm assuming it's kind of everyone because we all rely on infrastructure services. And can you give me an example? And I quite like, and we recently presented at a conference, your coffee bean example. So can you explain to me and our listeners what is an example of infrastructure resilience and who would it be relevant to?
Yeah, absolutely. So you are 100% right. Infrastructure relates to all of us, whether we know it or not. So you walk into a public building, you're in a piece of infrastructure, and how well that's built, how well that's designed and built, and how well it's maintained impacts directly on how safe you are in that building, how usable that building is, and how you're able to keep that building operating when circumstances get a bit different. And infrastructure works really well 99.9% of the time. So well, we don't even know it's there. But when it doesn't work well, we certainly know about the lack of it. The coffee example is a good one because it's very relatable. So the example I like to give of the complexity of providing infrastructure to everyone, to people in the street, people wherever they are, is when you walk into a coffee shop and ask for your cup of coffee. Quite often, I tend to have a bit of a gratitude exercise, I guess, where I think about how that coffee has come to me And most people thank the barista, which makes perfect sense. That's common good manners. But they don't really think beyond the barista to where all those things have come from. So to get that cup of coffee from your barista in your local coffee shop, there's 4 really complex and complicated supply chains to make that happen. But one of them is the coffee beans. The coffee beans almost always start overseas. They're grown on a farm in another country. They need to be transported to a port. They're shipped overseas to another port, and then they're transported to a processing centre where they're dried and they're ground. That's usually in the country of the destination country, like Australia. And then, of course, there's another transport layer where once they're packaged, they get shipped to the coffee shop. And that's just the beans. You think about the electricity. It's generated in an electricity plant. It could be coal, could be renewable energy. The fuel source, for our purposes, is immaterial, but obviously has a big impact on the world. And then it's transmitted through large transmission lines. It goes into a substation where it's stepped down into distribution lines, and then from distribution lines into the reticulation, which gives you the 240 volts that comes out of your wall. And then the water is stored in a bulk facility like a dam or some sort of reservoir. It's again transmitted through a transmission pipe. It's treated at a water treatment plant to make sure that it's safe to use. And then it's distributed again through a smaller network to get to the place where you use it. Distribution and then potentially reticulation. And then you get the water at your location. So you've got the beans, you've got the electricity, and you've got the water that you need to make a cup of coffee, but you need the person as well. And generally they have to get to work somehow. So there's a whole transport network that they use to get to work. And that could involve all sorts of things like trains or cars. Cars on roads require fuel. Fuel needs electricity to pump. And you know, however they got to work, there's a whole bunch of subsystems that allow them to get to work. So a transport network can't run without electricity, and it can't run without communications. That's how our traffic signals work, and train signalling and those sorts of things. So you can see that as we build up this picture of the infrastructure required for a simple $5 cup of coffee, hopefully it's not costing you too much more than that. There's a lot that goes into making that happen, and many, many really complex and technical systems that allow that transaction to occur.
So ultimately, infrastructure resilience, I guess, underpins our system and way of living. So, I mean, I'm talking to Margaret, Dr. Margaret Morton, in a future episode about community resilience, obviously being the people and how people interconnect. But I guess if like the people and the infrastructure is kind of really interwoven, because we can't live, or certainly not to the level of how we'd like to live at the moment, if we don't have those systems and structures working for us to deliver the likes of the coffee beans and the water and the electricity and the ability to get to work.
You're absolutely right. And I've had my own personal experiences of hazard events that have turned into disasters, especially living in North Queensland. We get hit with fairly significant cyclones. And I firsthand, I've seen what happens to the community when the infrastructure is kind of yanked out from underneath them. And when infrastructure fails, it can fail in safe ways or unsafe ways. What we want is infrastructure to fail safely so that it doesn't present a hazard. But I have seen infrastructure fail in ways that weren't safe and actually increase the risk to the community. So it's really important that not only do we provide a good service, we provide a safe service in the world of infrastructure, but that when it fails safe. We don't add to the risk of the environment from a natural hazard or similar events. It could be a technological hazard, it could be a human-made hazard, and when we face the elements of sabotage or terrorism, like they do in many countries actually. So there's a real key element to making sure that our infrastructure is well supported. It is resilient, and that actually contributes actively to community resilience. One of the interesting things is, and it's not always well understood from the infrastructure operators themselves, is that the community can be really active contributors to how well the infrastructure behaves. And we see that in airports when I used to visit an airport 30 years ago, you'd walk through the airport and you wouldn't really care what was lying on the ground. And of course, if there's a stray bag in an airport these days, it's panic stations, and we have to investigate that and find out where that is. So, and you see this with local councils too. They have apps on your phone where you can take a photo of a leaking water main, or some sort of water on the road, or some sort of other hazard, and you can send that via your application to the council and they can get onto it and fix it, so that then they're not faced with, a loss of water and increases to the cost of supplying that infrastructure. So I think what we need to understand, not only the complexity of the infrastructure, but the complexity of the relationship of the community with the infrastructure, and how we can actually get the community to help us to make sure that infrastructure stays resilient, because it's really important to them. Whether they know it or not, it's extremely important to them that infrastructure is able to operate in a variety of conditions.
Yeah, and it's funny because, again, before we met, and even we've been collaborating on a few speaking opportunities in that recently, and like I just never would have even thought of it. And do you think then, when we're talking about resilience, and obviously that's a buzzword at the moment, and a lot of what we focus on is community resilience and also organizational resilience, do you think infrastructure resilience is kind of like the forgotten cousin or the third child, or do you think it needs a bit more airtime?
Absolutely. I believe it's one of those elements that if we have a greater awareness of it and the importance of it, many people would have hopped on a train in a major capital city in Australia and seen the sign, if there's a problem with this infrastructure, please report it. Here's a phone number or whatever, and kind of ignored that, not being particularly worried about that. But I think if we all appreciated the sort of long supply chains that are created with our infrastructure, I think we would possibly do a better job of supporting our infrastructure to remain. We're just so used to it being available to us. But as I've said, I've seen in many events where it's not available, and that creates a lot of stress and strain on the community. And look, it's a time when they need their infrastructure. So you can imagine how much more difficult it is to recover from a really large hazard event when you don't have electricity, or worse, you don't have clean water. So, these sorts of things are really, really important to understand. And look, I think in Australia especially, our infrastructure operators do an excellent job. And in some ways, that's why we don't know much about this, is because they do such a good job that we're so used to having the infrastructure available to us and the service that it provides, more importantly, that we don't even think about it. And to some extent, it's a real acknowledgement of how well we do this in this country. However, it's important that we all play our part, and that we kind of dedicate a little bit of time and effort into this. Because when the bridge is out and you can't cross the river to get to the hospital, both really significant pieces of infrastructure, that's when things start to get a little bit problematic. And we would be better thinking about that effectively before the storm, before the hazard. If we do some work getting our infrastructure ready, preparing our infrastructure, making sure it's available during that variety of circumstances before the storm, we're going to do so much better than trying to fix it in recovery. And, I think that's been really acknowledged by people who are invested in infrastructure resilience over the past decade or so, probably longer. But we started out with this idea of the fact that assets needed to be hardened. And this has been a concept in engineering for many, many years. They called it robustness. We now call it resistance to hazards. But very, very similar concept where, you build the asset strong enough and it won't blow over, won't get knocked over by water or whatever. But we've grown from that. We're now we've sort of matured in infrastructure resilience land, and we're now understanding the whole system more and the interconnectedness between systems. So how the electricity system reacts to the water system, and how electricity supports the communication systems, but the communication systems also support the water systems. And then you get a hospital, and they use all of those. A hospital can't function without water, and has trouble functioning without electricity, and the transport systems and the communication systems that are required to keep a really complex piece of infrastructure like a hospital running. So we're kind of maturing in our understanding of how complicated it all is, and we're working together better through those disparate systems. They've been traditionally sort of looked after in isolation, really, where a particular company looks after the electricity, a particular company looks after the water. What we're trying to do is sort of build the bridges, forgive the pun, build the bridges across those different sections of infrastructure so that they work better holistically together, and we do a better job. So we move from this idea of building things stronger to actually building them better, providing a better service, not just build back better, but build to last. Make sure that whatever we build is going to have a very long, useful life, but make sure that's true in a systems concept where the system itself has a really good adaptive capacity. It can absorb interruptions, it can absorb hazards and continue operating in some capacity. And kind of the holy grail in systems resilience and infrastructure is to get systems that can anticipate hazard events. They can anticipate disruptions, potentially change the way that they operate with this predictive capacity. And then also a restorative capacity moves towards a transformative capacity where the system is actually better prepared for the next shock or stress, and it can effectively learn. We create these learning systems that can do a much better job when the next hazard comes along.
So with in the world of resilience and disaster resilience, and resilience is kind of a bit of a buzzword at the moment, I think. Where does, and I kind of know the answer because we've obviously created a presentation about unified resilience, but can you just explain where does infrastructure resilience fit alongside community and organisational resilience?
Yeah, absolutely. I think community resilience should be the ultimate goal. There wouldn't be any infrastructure if there wasn't a community. So, there's no electricity supplied to the middle of the desert because there's no need for electricity to be supplied to the middle of the desert. So wherever there's a large population of people, that's where the infrastructure gets thicker, if you like. The systems there are many more systems, and the systems are usually stronger. We would certainly hope that they were stronger where there are large concentrations of people. So community resilience is key, but I think both infrastructure resilience and organisational resilience have a key role in underpinning that community resilience. And the example is, when there's been large events either in Australia or overseas, I'm thinking of Hurricane Katrina in the United States. When a terrible event comes along that does damage to major pieces of infrastructure that then affects the community, I know for a fact that the company that was looking after the energy grid over during Hurricane Katrina, people whose houses had been effectively washed away were sleeping on the floor in the office in an attempt to make sure that they could continue providing electricity to the rest of the people that needed it in that area to maintain their recovery. So those organisations are responsible for sort of mobilising those people that belong to the organisation. But of course, we draw those from the community. And without the community, you can't staff the organisation, which means the infrastructure suffers. It can't be run as well because there's always going to be a need for people to support that infrastructure, restore that infrastructure, and allow that infrastructure to get to that sort of holy grail of being able to anticipate and transform in the face of these really large events. And the other thing I'd add to that is we know that the events are more frequent, and we know that they cost more, they damage more infrastructure. That's not just a function of the events, it's a function of how we build cities and communities. We build them sometimes in hazard-prone situations, or we build them in a more aggregated way with larger urban density. So we know that there's more risk. So there is a natural risk that comes from more frequent natural hazards, but there's a created risk as well, less of a natural risk, an unnatural risk. We actually add to the risk by creating some vulnerabilities. So it's really important that we understand the importance of infrastructure resilience when right back at the planning stage, when we're planning new communities, when we're planning for new infrastructure, we work on it then because it's much easier and cheaper to fix it right back at the start than it is to try and sort of adapt our infrastructure once it's in place.
Can I ask you, you mentioned a couple of things, but what is great, if you had to pick one thing, what's great about infrastructure resilience in Australia right now?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think there have been several projects and many projects across, especially the last 20 years, and I've been fortunate enough to, be involved in some of those, recognising that infrastructure is key. And in fact, in some ways, the current major crisis that the world faces recognises the benefits of infrastructure in allowing us to help us exit that crisis. So we know that there's a thing called the infrastructure gap. So there's the infrastructure we need and the infrastructure that we have, and the difference is the infrastructure gap. And, trying to create an economic recovery from the COVID-19 crisis, most countries, certainly most countries that can afford to, are using infrastructure as a means to kind of build ourselves out of a hole in the economy. And I think that's really helpful. We know that can work. That can provide both economic stimulus, but also amenity to the community so that then they can create more business and better communities. So we know that works. What I would say, though, is we need to get the message about infrastructure resilience out into the wider community so that when we build the when we fill that infrastructure gap and we build the new infrastructure that I know we're going to build over the next 20 years. And in fact, in the next 20 years, we will build worldwide more infrastructure than we have in the rest of human history combined.
Wow.
So we know, it's massive. We know that we're going to be filling that infrastructure gap because it's so large, and we know we need this infrastructure. But what's important to me is that we build it to last. We don't just build it to meet the needs of right now. We build it to meet the needs of the useful life of that infrastructure. If you look at a piece of infrastructure like the Sydney Harbour Bridge, which has been a very successful piece of infrastructure, but it's been in place for over 120 years. So if we build the infrastructure if we just build the infrastructure to meet the needs of today, we really are losing an opportunity, because much of the infrastructure that we built 100 years ago, we're still using today. And we know that the world is going to be a very different place in 100 years with climate change and the changes in the frequency of natural hazards and even the human-made threats. We know that the world is going to be a different place. So we should be using our imagination to imagine the absolute set of hazards and disruptions that could occur to our infrastructure, and building some resilience in right back at the planning stage. And now is the time to be doing that. We are going to have an infrastructure boom as a result of the COVID-19 crisis. We would have had that without COVID, but it's absolutely going to be accelerated. So there's an imperative. It's time critical that we have this message about infrastructure resilience. We integrate it into our projects, and we build our assets to last. We don't build them so that they blow over and we have to rebuild them again. There's some terrible examples from right around the world where we've built infrastructure, usually for economic reasons, in a hazardous location. And then some event has happened, the infrastructure's been damaged or washed away, and then we've built it again to the same standard in the same place. And, it just takes a little bit more thought to potentially say, well, look, we should build it to a better standard, or we should move it to a different, less hazard-prone location. And if we do that, we tend to add maybe 1% to 2% to the cost of the project. But of course, we more than recover that in the maintenance and reconstruction costs across the life of the asset. And most infrastructure, minimum 20-year life, and much of it has an 80-year life, potentially 100, 120-year life. So we know that we've got the time to recoup those costs if we spend just a little bit more at the outset. If we make sure that the infrastructure is both resilient and sustainable, the world is actually going to be a better place as a result.
Yeah. And I think, Chris, it's, people have been saying it for years and probably decades, the sense that if we put a little bit more in the beforehand, then it's going to be so much better in the during and the after. And I think, that's been a great overview and I guess confirmation that infrastructure and resilient infrastructure is just as important as resilient businesses and resilient communities as well. Now, I like to finish all my podcasts with the same question. So not restricted to your focus area, what do you think would be the 2 things that you'd like to see done differently in the disaster space? So anything at all.
Great. Well, I might pick one that I think is effectively low-hanging fruit, one that we can do with just a little bit of effort in time, maybe a little bit of effort in money, but I'd love to see better partnerships. I'd love to see better collaboration. So as you mentioned, many people don't quite understand the importance of infrastructure, especially when it comes to, disaster response or, when there's a hazard that affects a community and how important it is. There are many people that do, mind you. But what I'd love to see is better partnerships, both infrastructure providers with other infrastructure providers. So this is what I was talking about before. We know the electricity network really heavily interacts with the communications network, and we know that they both heavily really interact with the water network. And then we know that all of those interact with the transport network, and then we know that they interact with the hospital, which is absolutely critical when we talk about any type of hazard. So I'd love to see better communication between those different elements of infrastructure and the organisations that look after them, so that we can effectively do a better job of making sure that the hospital stays running and that people have fresh water. So communication, partnerships, that can be sort of outworked as far as multi-agency exercises and those sorts of things are concerned. So I'd love to see better partnerships between the providers in a single infrastructure space, better partnerships between providers across infrastructure, but then better partnerships between infrastructure organisations and emergency management organisations. So depending upon what jurisdiction you're from, emergency management may be centred on local government or state government, federal government. And I'd love to see those partnerships really, really strong. I call them, and I borrowed this from a colleague, your 3 a.m. friends, the people who will take the phone call at 3 a.m. That network of 3 a.m. friends needs to be, pretty wide and pretty strong, so that when things do go wrong at 3 a.m. in the morning, that someone will take your call, and then you can effectively, hopefully, reduce the impact and the consequence of any hazard events, and get on to, restoring services and making sure everybody's safe as soon as you possibly can. Number 2 for me would be a longer term view. So instead of just building our infrastructure to current standards or codes, I'd love to see us taking that longer view. And when infrastructure is in a more hazardous place, go beyond the codes, go beyond the standards, actually build it to last. So, and the UN had a great week the International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction in 2019 was focused on infrastructure resilience to raise that visibility. And the hashtag was #Build to Last. That is vital. We need to build these things to last. We can't just build them to the standard in hazard-prone locations. We need to think more about what we're doing. So creating those systems that will serve us not just during the best of times, which quite often they do. They're very capable systems that serve us during the best of times, but absolutely those systems that will also serve us during the worst of times. And it doesn't have to be expensive. There are many, many ways that we can do it without adding massive expense to either new projects or existing systems and processes. So ways in which we can increase the utility of these infrastructures, regardless of the circumstances that beset them.
And Chris, just to link that back to what you were saying before about communities needing to understand more, I mean, there are some great opportunities to engage communities to identify some of these solutions and then be part of creating the solutions as well, so that, they know how to change their behaviours, or they know what to do or what to expect when a disaster happens, and some of these infrastructures are tested and the systems are tested. So I think it's a really great point, and definitely something that could be integrated into a holistic approach to disaster resilience across all stakeholders and across all types of resilience.
Renae, you are absolutely spot on. And there are plenty of infrastructure providers that do an excellent job of this. Water and electricity sort of stand out to me as the ones that are really good at what they'll call it community education, but they really are taking their customers on a journey with them of understanding the importance of their water supply and understanding the importance of their energy supply, and indeed how to stay safe when they're disrupted. So absolutely, I think that's key. There are people doing it well, and I just think, again, we all need to partner to perhaps do it better and understand each other just that little bit more.
Yeah, definitely. I think it also links back to, I like the businesses who look or consider their stakeholders more than just their shareholders. So they look at the various, customers, communities, suppliers, and they engage them and interact with them before, during, and after disasters, which means that, again, the systems and the processes and the networks and the 3M phone calls are all set up with much a broader kind of level of consideration, which means it's going to have a broader kind of impact when it's needed most.
Absolutely.
Chris, thank you so much for chatting with me. We could always have really fun and robust conversations, and it's been great to be able to share a bit more about infrastructure resilience. I've learned a lot from you over the past year or so since we connected, and it's really great to be able to share that with others as well. So today I've been talking with Chris Quin, and he is the Director of Resilient Projects. His contact details are on the website if you'd like to check it out. I'm sure he'll be happy if you want to connect with him on LinkedIn or any of the other channels. And we've been talking about the new era of infrastructure resilience. And again, infrastructure resilience certainly wasn't on my agenda until I connected with Chris, and now I see where it fits in, and it's a real fundamental part of resilience at that systemic level and that holistic level across communities and individuals and organisations. From that perspective, that we absolutely need to have infrastructure and systems. So thanks so much, Chris. We'll talk to you again soon.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
that's the end of this episode of Doing Disasters Differently, the podcast, which I hope you found to be relevant, informative, and inspiring. If you're interested in participating in the conversation or to connect with me personally, please visit corporate2community.com. Until the next episode, stay safe and remember we all have a role to play in thinking differently and doing differently before, during, and after disasters.